So welcome to all of you. Happy Lunar New Year. We're getting to have our conference on a holiday, a beautiful holiday that I was not accustomed to celebrating until I lived in Taipei, Taiwan. I was a Fulbright scholar. I think the first and only Fulbright scholar to base my entire Fulbright project on outdoor adventure therapy. But I was hosted by a dear friend, Dr. Chimo Shea, a mentor of mine, the founder of Asia AEE and Taiwan Outward Bound, very accomplished mountaineer and outdoor educator. And so when I was living there, I got to experience firsthand the joy and connection of the Lunar New Year. So happy Lunar New Year. Brad, that was a long bio, and I feel like I should also say I am a mother and a wife, and those things don't usually make your bio, but they make your life. And I just want to say thank you to my husband, my life partner, Billy Norton, and my 3 kids. Oh, I get a little emotional. They are the reason that I do this work. I had the privilege of going to the session, the interview with Earl Hunter, and he was saying that his legacy is also about his children and his children's children. And so I resonated with that. Spoiler alert, I am a tough little crybaby. As a woman, I have been shamed and socialized to believe that tears are weakness, but when I worked with many men in my history of Outward Bound, I would tell them in our pairing meetings, the first thing I would say to them is, my tears are not a weakness. You don't have to fix them. If anything, just shove me in the tent and chuck some mini Snickers bars at me and I will be fine. So sometimes I reflect on why I was asked to give this keynote, but then I was looking at the mission of the Wilderness Education Association, and it says that this organization, and this is my first WEA conference, so yay for that. I'm reading the chat as I'm talking, which is not good for my multitasking brain, but I'm glad there are other criers out there too. So WEA is committed to creating authentic leaders with the judgment to make decisions that work, that manage risk, that protect the environment, and achieve the outcomes of the experience. The key word for me is authentic. Whew. So, as such, I would like to start off leaning into that authenticity by owning the limitations of my lens as I give this keynote. In particular, the lens of my whiteness, the lens of my white privilege, the lens of the internalized white supremacy that I have been trying to untangle and dismantle, and the implicit bias that comes with that. I'm grateful for COVID in the sense that it slowed us all down enough to take a much harder look at what we needed to look at in terms of racial and social justice in this country. So with that, I would like to, I guess I have to change this over here. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I would like to let you all know I am calling in from what is now called Texas, and I live with gratitude on the unceded and stolen lands of the Tonkawa and Karankawa people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live. And I extend my respect and gratitude to elders past and present. This always felt funny to me to do an acknowledgement like this as a person with a European colonizing background. But then I realized it's actually even more important for me to do this because it grounds me in the larger history and the intergenerational trauma that we all live in as Americans in particular. I know we have an international audience, and I am so thankful for that. And you have your own histories to grapple with. But in the US, we are grappling with the fact that we are a nation that is built on the backs of genocide and slavery. And until we tell the truth about that, we will not move forward. I also want to do a grief acknowledgement. This is a beautiful mosaic of photos put together by an artist from Detroit. I believe his name is Eric Milliman. I apologize if I get that wrong. But these are people in the Detroit area who have died of COVID-19. We are at almost 500,000 deaths related to COVID-19. And for me, that is sobering. And I'm a social worker. So when I think about the world, I think about person in environment. So here I am, I'm a person giving a keynote. And the larger context in which I am delivering this keynote is sobering. And so I'm going to ask us just to take a moment of silence. I recognize that your lives may have been touched by COVID-19 in a way that was very painful. So I'm just going to ask us to take that moment of silence and acknowledge this context of grief. And maybe a deep breath. Thank you. You know, famous American mountaineer Willie Unsold used to start off his talks with a mason jar. This is an Nalgene, but with a mason jar. And in that mason jar were his toes. I only have water, I promise. My toes are thankfully on my feet. He lost his toes due to frostbite on that famous summit of the western ridge of Mount Everest. Now we have to ask ourselves, that's a little weird. Why did he walk around with his toes in a jar? I don't have the answer for this. My guess is on some level, it was a reminder to be humble, that there are consequences and risk involved in our adventures. At the same time, I have to think maybe those toes in the jar were like a good luck charm, right? A reminder like, I survived, I did this. And everywhere I go, I have these to remind me that I can do hard things. I love this word talisman. As wilderness educators, we have things that we imbue with meaning, we imbue with stories, and they become talismans for us in really hard times. So for me, I have this paddle. Oh, my background. Look, I can pretend like I'm paddling. My background, by the way, is my favorite place in the world, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness on the Minnesota-Canadian border, where I was an outward bound instructor for 10 seasons. And this paddle is the 10-year paddle, engraved and inscripted, and it says, in honor of 10 years of dedicated service to the Voyager Outward Bound School. And more than that, in terms of my time and relationship with Outward Bound, because I joke, I was an Outward Bound student, which I'll tell you about. I was an Outward Bound instructor and course director, and then researcher, which is definitely not as much fun. And now I am an Outward Bound mom. So 2 of my children have gone on Outward Bound and are alums of Outward Bound. So I encourage you to think, what is your talisman? What objects have you imbued with meaning that you hold onto, that give you strength? Because we need that now more than ever. We are living in a time of global collective trauma. COVID-19, racial injustice, political unrest, global climate change, and man-made and natural disasters, a mental health and substance abuse pandemic right on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, due to isolating and quarantining and anxiety and ambivalence. Whew. Y'all, we need to take another breath. I don't know about you, but I've never spent so much time on a screen. This sedentary lifestyle, this addiction to technology, the chronic stress, and then on top of all of that, we are living in the age of disinformation, where we can't even trust facts or one another. We need our talismans. We need to hold on. We need to remind ourselves. I hold this paddle and I think about doing a 2-mile portage on the Engelworm Trail, carrying an 80-pound Grumman and not taking a break. That was kind of dumb. I totally could have bridged that boat, but there was something in me that was like, I wonder if you can go the whole way with black flies and mosquitoes taking chunks out of my skin. I've had to remind myself of those things in difficult times. And you have probably had to remind yourself too. We work in an industry, and I don't use that word actually. I know y'all do, but I use the word kind of field of practice, I think, because for me, that's my relationship with the outdoors as a social worker, is that outdoor adventure therapy is a field of practice or a modality or an intervention. But for the sake of the parlance of this organization and our times, right, we work in an industry, a field that has been affected by this virus. I have had the privilege of being a part of CORE, a group of researchers studying COVID effects on outdoor education and recreation. Some of you in the audience are leading the charge on that research that I have been able to be a part of. So thank you. I know that we have seen programs shut down. We have seen programs need small business loans to stay afloat. We've seen programs scramble to figure out risk management. It's been a stressful time. Some of you may have lost your jobs, lost your businesses, had compromises to your health and the health of your employees. This has been hard on our field. But think about the possibilities. Wow, it's like the whole world woke up and said, well, I think I'll go outside today because that's the only thing I can do. What a gift. What a gift. The outdoors, an invaluable resource. There's a website here. It's outdoorindustry.org, COVID-19 resources. You can go to that. And if you scroll through that, there's just so much there about how we have been engaging with the outdoors during this time. So on one hand, it's been a time of great risk to our field. And on the other hand, it's been a time of great possibility. And isn't that life? Isn't that life, that tension between risk and grief and loss and possibility and hope and new beginnings? So we live in that tension as outdoor educators. As outdoor educators, we live in that tension all the time. I remember one outward bound trip I led. It rained for 15 days straight. And I will tell you that when that sun finally came out, first of all, it was like a distant memory. And then it felt like such a reward. I was able to appreciate it so much more. So I hope we can appreciate these possibilities, because we are in a changing world. We are practicing and we are adapting. There is no going back to normal. We are considering how to pivot, how to shift, how to grow, how to evolve. And yet we also have this history, this deep history. You all, the Wilderness Education Association, has this deep history. And so it was really fun. For this talk, I decided, all right, I wonder if I can play that Kevin Bacon game, 6 Degrees of Separation, only instead of Kevin Bacon, we're going to do it with Paul Petzl, right? So what's really fun about a PowerPoint is I can write on it. So here's Paul, right? We'll put a little heart around Paul. Okay. Now, who are the rest of these white dudes, right? Notice they're all white men. I'll make a point about that. So we've got Paul Petzl. So how did I get, what's my connection to Paul Petzl? Well, I was an Outward Bound student when I was 19. I'll tell you about that. This is Kurt Hahn, the founder of Outward Bound. But it wasn't until I was a grad student at Minnesota State Mankato when I met this guy. Some of you are writing in the chat, Jasper, right? And Jasper knew that I had been an Outward Bound instructor, and Jasper has a long history with Outward Bound. And Jasper said, Christine, you need to go work for Outward Bound. So he planted that seed. Meanwhile, he told me all about this guy, right? The dude that keeps his toes in a jar. That's Willie Unsold. He told me one of the greatest stories about Willie Unsold, about how when he was in a conflict with another person, Jasper went to Willie Unsold, who was his advisor at Evergreen, and he said, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do with this person. And Willie Unsold said, listen, they're just trying to show you their marbles, right? Like a little kid. We all want to just have our marbles be seen, and we want our marbles to be the best and prized. And that metaphor has helped me get through a lot of conflicts. Well, I took Jasper's advice, and I went and I worked at the Voyager Outward Bound School. And there I met this guy. This is Josh Miner. This is a portrait of Josh Miner, who a lot of people credit as bringing Outward Bound to the US from Kurt Hahn's work in the UK. Fun fact, Josh Miner came to Ely, to the Voyager Outward Bound School, and talked at our staff, all staff training. And we had a big party, as we do at the end of all staff. And Josh Miner stayed for it. And all the Outward Bound instructors were playing quarters. And Josh Miner had never seen this game called quarters, where you take a quarter and you try and pop it off the table and into your glass that is perhaps filled with an adult beverage. So I said, do you want to learn how to play? And so I walked Josh Miner over and I taught Josh Miner how to play quarters. Fun fact. So then, moving on, I'm a wilderness educator now. I'm working for Outward Bound. And what happens a lot of times is we get stuck in that instructor role and we forget to have our own adventures where we're back in the student mode. So in my 30s, I said to my husband, we're going to climb the Grand Teton. I want to be a student again. And we signed up for a course with Exum mountain guides. The funny thing is, it was guide training. And they said, oh, you know, we don't have any guides available because they're all in training. So you're going to have to go out with this guy right here. That's Peter Lev. Ironically, Peter Lev was in a tent with Willie Unsold and Willie Unsold's daughter, Nanda Devi, when she died. The connections in this field and the history is astounding. And Peter Lev took my husband and I up the Grand and taught us how to set a boot axe belay and glissade down that front glacier of that beautiful mountain. So how did I, a young woman, get where I am if my only role models were all these white dudes? Fun fact, I did not. I got there because I had an Outward Bound instructor when I was 19. This is me. I was 19 at the Hurricane Island Outward Bound School. And I had an instructor named Christine, ironically, and she was a badass, y'all. She was amazing. And on my 20th birthday, on my course, she challenged me to do some really hard climbs. And after that course, she actually leaned over and whispered in my ear as we were packing our gear to leave. And she said, hey, you know, you could do what we do, pointing to herself and the other instructor. You could do what we do if you'd ever want to. What? I was 20, and this badass woman was telling me I could be like her. I don't think you realize how accessible that made it for me. Far more accessible. And I have a lot of love in my heart for all these men, but far more accessible to become a wilderness educator and spend a life and a beautiful career doing this work that I love. And even at one point, climbing the Grand Teton, right, with Peter Lev. That's the friction pitch. This is my favorite place in the world to be, in a canoe. This is one of my foster care students. I use a lot of adventure-based group work to create more equity and access and safety in the outdoors for young people in foster care that never had that experience. And this is river tracing in Taiwan. What a life, what a privilege. I love this quote by Susan Froderberg from A History of Women Mountaineers. She says, shame on any person or group so easily threatened who lump people into a category of this or that and insist you stay in your designated lane. This as opposed to acknowledging the unique human being each of us happens to be. Only by adopting the perspective that none of us know who a person might turn out to be can we live in a world that is morally fair. Then we may each have the opportunity and privilege to do the work we most want to do. Love that quote. Representation matters. If you can see it, you can be it. I had someone who looked like me whisper in my ear, hey, you could do what we do if you would ever want to. I put this picture of this beautiful book that should be mandatory reading for all wilderness educators, the Palgrave International Handbook of Women and Outdoor Learning. I was honored to be an author in this text. It is filled with the wisdom of outdoor educators who identify as female, who share their experiences, who create a larger history. Here is something I hear all the time living in Texas. Oh my gosh, if you take down that Confederate statue, if you threaten or challenge the dominant narrative in any way, you're rewriting history. Not rewriting history. I'm actually creating space for more history to be written. So several slides ago, it was all these bigger than life white men. And now we have this book, and we have practitioners and adventurers and role models who are making their stories now a part of history because we're creating space for that. There is more history in our field that needs to be written, and not by white folks, not by able-bodied folks, right? not by Americans, by everyone. We are creating space for that history. It's so exciting. So Anya talked about this movement to diversify the outdoors. I actually heard a woman talk about decolonizing the outdoors. And I think this is a really interesting point, because Earl made this point in his talk, that it's not just about equity and access, it's also about safety. So even when folks have the ability to get outside, do they feel safe? Do they feel like they can be themselves? And the thing is, I'm not even just talking about emotional safety. I'm talking about physical safety. The feeling that there might be a threat to my body if I am out in this space. As a woman, I can identify with that. When I was 41, I guess the tail end of 40, I wanted to do it for my 40th birthday, but I had a baby. So I had to wait a year. And I wanted to do a solo trip in the Boundary Waters. I had never done a solo trip in the wilderness before, and that was so important to me. So I'm an experienced paddler, and I know how to navigate. And I went out. Remember, I paddled away from my 1-year-old and my husband, and I went out for 4 days and 3 nights. It wasn't a long trip, but I remember, of course, paddling a solo canoe into a headwind and getting lost temporarily, trying to find a campsite. The irony, it was Father's Day weekend. So there were all these men in the Boundary Waters, just groups of men, Boy Scouts, father-son groups. And I found this one campsite. I saw it in the back of this bay on the map. And I thought, oh, please, God, let it be open. And I paddled in, and it was in the burn area. The Boundary Waters had this huge fire years ago. And I thought, well, maybe no one will want to camp there because it's right in the burn area. And as I paddled around this bend, at the tip of that point was a group of men who were drinking. And I got scared. I was like, oh shit, they've got the map too. They're right there. They know they see me. I'm alone. And I paddled back into that bay, and I set up my camp, and I just sort of said a prayer. But I felt that fear. And that is something we have to address when we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? How do we create physical and emotional safety that's related to belonging? So, got to be mindful of my time. The chat is blowing up. I appreciate y'all staying engaged. What happens next? Where do we go from here? All right. This is exciting to me. I've got 3 words for you. They resonate for me. I hope they resonate for you. The first is re-emergence. I love this little, what is he, a seal or a sea lion or a sea otter? I don't know. Sorry, someone put it in the chat for me. The coast is clear, or are there people, right? A seal, thank you. How many of you are feeling this way right now? Like, can I come out now? Oh crap, there's still people, right? The thing about trauma, the kind of global collective trauma we're experiencing, is that it's making us afraid of one another, right? And obviously we want to be safe and take these precautions around COVID, but how will we reemerge and come into a place where we can learn how to interact again, and learn how to communicate, and learn how to trust? And you and I know that wilderness education plays a role in that. We know from the experiences we have in the field with groups that have to go out and learn how to be with one another, that this can help us with reemergence if we are so intentional about the transfer of learning And we design our educational experiences for people with the end goal in mind of reemerging. Willie Unseld said the entire goal of education is to make better humans, right? So we have to emerge as better humans from this pandemic, from this crisis of humanity that we are facing. And I really believe that wilderness educators are uniquely suited to help humanity reemerge as better people. But reemergence does not preclude risk. This is an actual canoe from an actual trip that I was on. I just want to be like, it was not my boat, but it doesn't matter. It was the boat of someone I was with. And so as a crew, we had to gather that person's gear and get them in our boat and make an alternative plan. We had gone into the paddle shop before this trip, and the guy renting us the boats was like, well, are y'all canoers? And we were like, we're outward bound instructors. You can imagine the look on that dude's face when we were like, we wrapped a boat. Yep. Right. So our expertise and our talent and maybe our ego and our pride did not help us in this situation, because sometimes the current is stronger, right? Sometimes the circumstances we face, they are more powerful than we are. So I'm wrestling with these ideas. Reemergence must happen, but we will always be managing the risk around us. And we have to do that with intention and clarity and compassion. If we don't, we're going to stay disconnected. So my first what's next word is reemergence. My second is reconnection. And I love this little bird over here all by himself, kind of looking, I want to join again, right? And I'm looking, someone just wrote something in the chat that got my attention, but I don't want to get too distracted. Hang on, it was something about Confederate flags. And I think actually this is a really good point, because when I talk about reconnection as human beings and also with our planet, I cannot talk about kumbaya, can't we all just get along? There are things that are dividing us right now, things that are a threat to certain people's physical and emotional safety, right? And so when we think about the goal, the ultimate goal of wilderness education is helping us treat each other better, to be better humans, then part of what we have to do is tell the truth about what divides us. And part of that is the racism that lives in me, the implicit bias that lives in me, the entitlement and white privilege that lives in me. Part of it is the macro level environment that we exist in. But here's the thing. Wilderness education teaches us the truth about expedition behavior, right? It teaches us that we have an ethical obligation, if we are going to even have a chance of reaching the summit or finding a campsite or building a fire in a rainstorm, that we have got to help one another. If your pack is too heavy, then I need to take something out and put it in mine. If I'm going to go fill up my water bottle, I'm going to take yours with me and fill it up as well. This expedition behavior is a metaphor for empathy that is lacking in our society right now. And it is critical that we regain that empathy. And my belief is that one of the ways that we can do that is through wilderness education. Reconnection is not just an interpersonal phenomenon, though. We can't talk about relationships without talking about power. Chimamanda Adichie, many of you may have seen her very famous TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. She talks about an Igbo word called enkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another, right? There isn't room for that in expeditionary behavior. But this is a reality of our economic and our political worlds and of our communities and of our relationships and of our field. There is this hierarchy. But if we can liberate ourselves from this hierarchy by telling the truth about our history, by creating space for new history to be written, for more stories to be shared, for more people to be represented and brought in to create and enlarge a sense of belonging. If we can liberate ourselves from this hierarchy, we can equalize power by creating empathy and respect for other people's experiences. We know this from our work in the outdoors. A healthy community is like a healthy ecosystem. It is strong because it's diverse. I think about this all the time with ecological metaphors. We don't walk through a field of wildflowers as human beings and go, gosh, there are just too many colors. I wish they were all red. No, we celebrate that diversity. We're so grateful for biodiversity. It enlivens us. And we need to experience that with one another in our world. And I think we know that as wilderness educators, and that is part of our gift. The last word for you is resilience. Some people react really negatively to the word resilience, and I'll tell you why. It's a word that's been used, especially sometimes with communities of color, to sort of blame the victim, to sort of forget about actual systemic barriers, to kind of look at people who are resilient as those that somehow like pulled themselves up by their bootstraps or like rose above their circumstances. There was even a recent research study that I was reading about veterans, and it was connecting rates of PTSD post-combat to correlating that with adverse childhood experiences, that veterans who had more early childhood trauma were more likely then to develop PTSD post-combat. But the language of the study was really yucky. It was really biased. It was basically saying that the soldiers who were coming out of combat without PTSD were resilient, and those who were coming out of combat with PTSD were in the non-resilient group. And I really take issue with that, because what you're saying then is that if you struggle, if you're symptomatic of the challenges in your environment, then you're not resilient. Well, again, let's look to nature. Let's look to nature for ecological metaphors that teach us that there is no shame in the struggle. And as a matter of fact, it is that very struggle that makes us stronger. So in Biosphere 2 or 1, I can't remember where I read this, but they tried to create this perfect environment. And they tried to do this for all the organisms in this biosphere, including the trees. And one of the things that they found was that the trees were actually pretty weak. They had a less deep root system, and they were more apt to topple over. And they were like, but we don't understand it. We gave them all the nutrients. We gave them everything they needed to really thrive. But the one variable that they hadn't factored in was wind. And so I look at this tree on the coast and I think this tree is not missing wind. And it's even sort of bowed over. And you might say, oh, look at that poor tree. It's all bowed over. It's not upright and straight. It's not very resilient. But in fact, that tree has what scientists refer to as stress wood. that when a tree experiences this wind, this struggle, it actually grows denser, more fibrous cells, and they call it stress wood. And again, those of you that are wilderness educators, you know that metaphor is what we do. It is a key aspect of the transfer of learning. I have to wonder, and I hope, and maybe I'll just tell myself that this paddle is made out of stress wood. And then when I hold it in my hands, I feel the strength of that. And I remind myself when I am facing the same challenges that so many of you are facing, the global collective trauma, I will remind myself that we as a community are developing that stress wood, and that we are there to support each other through that. So now you see my background and another photo of it. That's a picture of me paddling a canoe. It is my sacred space. That is my daughter, Wendell, my youngest. She's named after Wendell Berry, the poet. Sometimes I think if I could stay in the wilderness forever, I would. Some of you might feel that way sometimes. But here is the beautiful idea that Willie Unsold captured so famously. He said, why not stay out there in the wilderness for the rest of your days? Because that's not where people are. The final test of the legitimacy of the experience, the final test of the legitimacy of the wilderness education experience is, how well does your experience of the sacred in nature enable you to cope more effectively with the problems of humanity when you come back, when you return to your life? So I leave you with that question. I leave you with that homework, right? I'm a professor, so I'll assign you some homework, which is to consider what are the best aspects of yourself as a wilderness educator that you bring back with you to your students, your participants, your family, your community, right? What are those lessons that you learn, those talismans that you have to remind you that you are a part of the story? You are an important and essential part of the story. This is a community. When I was in New Zealand, I got to keynote at the first adventure therapy conference in New Zealand. And I was given this ponamu made of New Zealand jade. And it's a symbol of infinity. And one of the things that they did when they presented this to me is they all held it. 60, 70 people held it in their hands and blessed it and gave it energy. And then they gave it to me. And this tradition, this Maori tradition, felt very strange and very beautiful to me. And it wasn't until I read a quote by Wendell Berry that said, health is membership, that it dawned on me that the whole point of, again, going out into the wilderness and coming back is so that we can create such a strong sense of love and belonging and membership in our world for all people. And that is my intention. That is what I want to do. And that is what I invite you to join me to do. So thank you so much for this time. I will turn it back over to Brad. I appreciate all of you listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. We have a few minutes for questions for Christine. If anyone would like to put questions in the chat, she'll be able to see those and respond to those. and we invite you to do so.
I stopped sharing my screen so I could see everybody.
There are many thank yous coming right now.
Oh, there you all are. Wow, how cool.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
How cool.
Nicole asked a question. Who was that quote you shared by? Who was the quote by that you shared?
About not staying out in the wilderness, or why we come back.
I believe that's the one
quote?
she's referring
Yeah,
to.
so that was Willie Unsold. And then the health is membership is Wendell Berry. Look at all these beautiful faces.
Again, if you have a question or a comment that you would like for Christine to see, please put that in the chat, and we're monitoring that right now.
I have both friends and hecklers in this audience, I can see.
Julia wrote, what would you say is your biggest motivation to move past adversity?
Oh, Julia. I don't like being stuck. I like moving on. I think that there's just a kind of a growth mindset that's probably for me connected to a wee bit of hyperactivity. But I want to be able to be my best self for people. I think when you're a mom, a lot of times you don't have much of a choice. When you're experiencing that personal turmoil, there are these little people that are like, I know you're crying right now, but can you make me some mac and cheese? So no doubt that has shaped my response to my own internal struggles.
A lot of movie parallels are coming in right now to Jeremiah Johnson, Into the Wild. And Erica has a question. What did you do in the off season, quote unquote, when you were working with Outward Bound?
Yeah, I was a social worker. I worked in the community. I was a school social worker, so I had summers off. I was teaching. I was a student. I was pregnant. All kinds of things. Piecing it together. I know sometimes this seasonal work is tough to piece together.
Another question is, do you believe outdoor recreation and wilderness education have potential in the research areas of national security?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I'm sure that's I might kick that over to one of my military pals that's on the call. I don't know. Not my area of expertise.
Ryan asked, you talked about us telling the history of the field. Who do you think is often overlooked, or who should we be celebrating, both past and present, as well as teaching about the field of outdoor leadership?
It's really funny. I almost made a slide of some of my both theoretical and actual heroes and sheroes of many genders and races. And I thought it was a little goofy and funny. I'm seeing in the chat, Marina Ewald. I certainly do appreciate, especially how women who just have like mentored me, the Denise Mittens and the Karen Warrens and the Nina Roberts and the T.A. Lefflers and the Tonya Grays, and as well as my current, sort of sisterhood of researchers and practitioners that I feel so held by, but also people who, again, aren't American. I feel like we're so in the US centric. And when I've been a part of the international adventure therapy community, and like the cultural learning for me has been such an assault on my American exceptionalism in a way that I am so grateful for. It has made me a better human. Like when we think about the bias that we kind of grow up with, we don't realize we are, that American exceptionalism is pretty strong. So I would say also international practitioners. I mentioned Dr. Shea, colleagues in New Zealand and Australia and Hungary. And we had a woman at the International Adventure Therapy Conference, Masego Thomuku, who's from Botswana, who runs Earth Adventure Therapy in Botswana. I mean, just like, it's a big world out there and we don't have all the answers. So yeah, so many people like Sanford Tillett here in the States. Yeah, too many to name, but they're there.
Alicia asks, what are some strategies you use as a woman when you feel you are not being heard in a group you are leading?
Oh boy. I mean, I'm kind of just like a bull. It's the year of the ox. Okay. So Lunar New Year, stubborn and determined. The thing I've had to give up in order to use my voice is needing everyone to like me. And that's an idol that is real hard to topple in my people pleasing, in the way that I was socialized as a white middle class woman, daughter of a preacher. I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah, I've had to give up that idol. So it's kind of like, I also, don't make fun of me, but I have a throat chakra candle and I light it when I have like a hard meeting or I've got to have a hard conversation, because I'm like, girl, you are going to use your voice. And I've also had to just push past, like, I might use my voice and I might cry, right? I mean, there's actual neuroscience that women's, limbic systems are more easily activated because our corpus callosum is bigger and we actually do more right brain, left brain integration, right? So that limbic system lights up in far more of our decision-making processes than it does. And I'm not trying to be gender binary. I'm just looking at some of the neuroscience research related to sex. But yeah, so I sometimes cry. Yeah, don't stop.
Emma's wondering what research you are most excited about right now.
Oh my gosh. That I'm doing. I just looked the other day. I have a lot going on. I am working on a manuscript about collegiate adventure therapy. So looking at how we can partner outdoor rec programs and college counseling centers on campuses all around the country to meet the unmet mental health needs of our college student population. I am doing some research with the Wilderness School in Connecticut, which for 30 years has been a part of the Department of Family and Protective Services, providing wilderness education experiences to youth in foster care and juvenile justice. I'm also working with Chicago Voyagers, which is a positive youth development program, also serving underrepresented youth in the Chicago area. So I really like to do a lot of community-based research around issues of equity and access. I did a study about using outdoor adventure therapy with women and children who are experiencing homelessness. Yeah, just things like that help me stay excited as a researcher, because sometimes that's boring. Sorry.
Priscilla asks, what are your thoughts on purposeful challenge and stress camping? Is there still a place for stress camping in our modern day? And if so, what should it look like?
Do you mean kind of like the whole like use of disequilibrium, right? Like kind of like intentionally challenging participants to like get them out of their comfort zone, Priscilla?
I think that's, yes.
Yes, she's saying yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we are an evolving field, and part of what we have to do, because we really we're interdisciplinary, so we have to look to sociology, anthropology, psychology, social work, neuroscience, and the neuroscience of trauma, as well as some of the studies on the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, now I'm speaking about a United States context, shows us that our participants are probably already coming in a state of disequilibrium. So we need to be trauma informed, which we could say, yeah, challenge by choice, but we really need to be trauma informed. We really need to get participants assessing themselves, checking in somatically with their bodies, with their minds, with their cultural values, their worldview. What feels safe for you in this moment? Where are you at? And that's a challenge to do in a group-based experience. But I think it's just like, what's challenging for one person is not going to be challenging for another. And so it's really like we have to move away from like a cookie cutter approach. And then even assessing like, where are you at today? Like I remember on my birthday, on my Outward Bound course, when I was 19, turning 20, my instructor said, so are you up for a little bit more of a challenge since you're not a teenager anymore? And I was like, yeah, but she asked me, let's say what if I had had my period that day, I might have been like, no, I'm like, I don't feel good. I might maybe wouldn't have wanted to put on a harness and like take on these challenging climbs, but she checked in with me and I was up for it. So challenge shouldn't go away, but I think we have to be really intentional about not applying it in a cookie cutter way or a way that's manipulative, but more in a relational way that honors who that person is.